Well, welcome everyone, and thank you all for taking the time to come out to our lecture this evening, where we're going to take a look at the land of Israel, which we'll learn tonight is the chosen land of God. So last week, our brother Isaac showed us, and we looked at how Israel as a people and as a nation are the chosen people of God. We saw the miraculous journey of how Israel has managed to survive despite the best efforts of the nations around, because of the protection God provides for them and because they are the chosen people of God. We know that from Isaiah 43 verse 10, which says, "Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." Israel was chosen by God as his nation, and that meant they would never be destroyed, as God had promised to be there for them. Now, even if you're not religious and therefore don't know much about Israel's history, just looking at what they've achieved as a nation from a human point of view compared to other countries of far greater populations shows there's something special about them. For example, it's a country that has only existed for 75 years as of today, as our chairman mentioned. Yet, as a military power, they are fourth in the world behind Russia, the US, and China. So it can't be ignored that they're definitely up there on the world stage. However, the topic we have for tonight is, again, about Israel. But this time, it's about the land rather than the people or the nation that inhabit it. So we could start by looking at the land today and how Israel as a nation came to inherit it. But I think it's useful to go right back to the beginning, back to where the idea of creating a nation of Israel was first born. Now, the reason I want to take you back there is because it will show the context for Israel's existence and also give an understanding as to why Israel is so formidable and so unstoppable even today. So let's go back to the beginning then, where we first read of God dedicating a land to his people. This whole process was started with Abraham, or as he was called back then, Abram. We probably know who Abraham is, or have at least heard his name mentioned in conjunction with the Bible. He was one of the three patriarchs God used to substantiate the promise of a people and a land in future references to this event and to this promise. For example, in Exodus 6 verse 3 to 4, he says, "And I appeared unto Abraham, Isaac, and unto Jacob by the name of God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh was I not known to them. And I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers." It's a regular theme throughout the Bible that reference is made to the three patriarchs as a single unit, because the promise to Abraham, which is the one we're going to have a look at, was also reiterated to Isaac and to Jacob, Abraham's son and grandson. Now, if you look at the second half of that quote we have on the slide, you can see that the speaker, which is in this case God, talks about a covenant he had with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that covenant is to give them the land of Canaan, as you can see there. So we can see there that God makes reference to the fact that in the past, he has made a promise, giving a portion of land to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Now, what it doesn't say yet is that this land is promised to the people of Israel. Now, that's what we'll get into, and we'll see how the promise of a land to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob is also a promise to the people of Israel even today. So let's have a look at the promise itself then. It first starts back in Genesis toward the beginning of the story of Abraham's life. Now, if we turn to Genesis 12, we can see the first of a multiple part covenant God made with Abraham in verse 1 to 3. I'll just read that out. "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now this promise to Abraham, as we said, is the first of a 6-part promise that focuses on promising a seed to Abram. For context, in the previous chapter, in chapter 11, verse 30, it was noted that Sarai, who was Abram's wife, was barren. She couldn't have any children. That's why this promise to Abram of having a seed, or a family that would turn into a great nation, was such a big thing, especially for Abram, because he'd already seen and would already know that he physically couldn't have children because his wife was not able to naturally do so. Now, when I say earlier that this is a 6-part promise, I mean there's 6 references we're going to be referring to that constitute the promise to Abraham, which we'll get into. So in this particular part of the promise, in these 3 verses you can see on the screen, God promised to Abram that he would have a future seed that would be a great nation, and that God would protect from those who cursed them. Breaking it down into its core elements, that's what that part of the promise ensured for Abraham. It ensured a seed, or a future family, that would turn into a great nation. So like we said, there's 6 parts to this promise, and they're all throughout the next few chapters. So we'll note down what each one promises as we go along. So the first one, like we said in this particular section, is a promise of a nation or a family. So the next part of this promise can be found in the same chapter, but a few verses further on, in verses 6 to 7, where it says, And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. Now this part of the promise is very explicit and very to the point. God told Abram that this is the land that his seed, or his future nation, is going to inherit or occupy. It's very simple, and it adds a second part to the promise that God has made to Abram so far. He's promised him a nation, and now he's promised him a land for that nation. Now this is the first time that we hear of a land being destined for the people of Israel. This, I guess you could say, is the birth of the idea that the land of Israel is going to belong to the Jews, or as we know, the children of Abraham, or the nation of Abraham. So let's add that to our list of things promised as part of the promise to Abraham. So now we've looked at the first 2 parts of that promise, and already we know that Abram was promised a nation that would be great, and he was also promised that this great nation would receive a land, and that land would be the land of Canaan. Now the next part of the promise is in Genesis 13, verse 14 to 17, where we read, And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it, and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Now this part of the promise is very important, not only for showing that God has promised this land to the seed of Abram, but also to show the constraints of both the promise and the time period. We see there that God tells Abram that all the land that he can see will belong to his seed. Now we see in future components of the promise that he's a little more specific about this land in regard to what area is promised to Abram's seed. He also goes on to say that this land will be promised to Abram's seed forever. This then means that if it's promised to the seed of Abram forever, that this covenant or promise with Abram is also going to last forever, and that also the protection that was promised from God to Abram's seed would also last forever. We can see that even today. The little nation of Israel, surrounded on pretty much all sides by enemy territory, still remains a powerful nation today. It's never been destroyed as a people or seed of Abram, and it remains even until today. It's a constant living reminder that God is still with the seed of Abram, as he promised all the way back at the beginning with Abram. So as part of the same component of the promise, this section we see on the screen, God also reiterates his promise about the seed of Abram, specifying that his seed would be a great seed. Great in the sense that they would be multitudinous, or a great nation, as he first mentioned. He compares it with the dust of the earth, basically saying that the seed of Abram would be countless. It would be so big that no one would ever be able to count the amount, just like we would never be able to count the dust on the earth, as he says. So you could say that this part of the promise to Abram reiterates the promise of both a land and a seed, or a nation, but also adds extra details about both, saying that the constraints of the land are as far as Abram could see, and that his seed would be an immense seed with a lot of people as part of it. So now we've seen three parts of the promise, and we've seen God promise Abram a seed, which already seemed impossible to Abram because of the barrenness of his wife, and he's also promised a land for the seed. The next three parts of the promise are the same in the sense that, like Genesis 13, they promise what has already been promised, but add extra details or extra clauses. So for example, part of the next one in Genesis 15, verse 4 to 5, it says, "And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be." This part of the promise reiterates the fact that the nation God has promised is going to come from Abram, directly from Abram. As stated in this section, God says that his son, and by extension, the nation of Israel, is going to come from Abram himself, even though at this stage in the record, Abram was still unable to have children with his wife. He then gives Abram another vision of what his seed is going to be like by comparing it to the stars in the sky. And as we know, man has yet to be able to count the stars even up until today, so we know what God was communicating to Abram. He was saying that the seed of Abram is going to be a lot of people. In the same chapter, in verse 18, it says, "In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates." So we know God has already promised a land to Abram, as we've said, but it's right here that he says exactly where and what the physical land is. As we can see, he promised from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. Now, as we saw before, Abram was promised the land that he could see, but now here we see a specification on what the land actually was and where it was. As it says, God promised Abram that this land would be from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. Now, just a side look into that area. This on the screen there is that whole area surrounding the area that we know is Israel today. And this here is Israel in the current day. Now, if we highlight where the great river of Egypt is versus the river Euphrates, we can see the size of current day Israel is nowhere near as big as the area that God promised it to be. It also never has been that big. We have to assume then that this is going to happen in the future. This is part of the promise that hasn't been fulfilled yet, just like we saw before, how God has promised this land to Abram and his seed forever. There's an element of permanence to this promise, and that means then that there's still more to come. We'll have a bit of a look at this future promise later, but first let's have a look at what this part of the promise promised to Abram. Like the previous part, this part of the promise reiterated its confirmation of the fact that Abram would have a seed and specified that it would come directly from Abram, no one else. It also reiterated the fact that this seed would have a land, and it gave some constraints to that land. So we've got two more parts of the promise that we can have a look at, and we'll just have a look at them now. And the next part is in Genesis 17, verse 4 to 11, where we can read, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Ye shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." So it's here that God changes the name of Abram to Abraham as a sign of what he is to be in the future. So Abram simply means exalted father, but Abraham means father of many. So God is showing to Abram, or as we know him now, Abraham, that this is a very permanent and a very sure promise. So much so that he's actually changed his name to reflect what his future lot is. So we also see here again a reiteration of past things that God has assured Abraham in the previous promises. And that's that his seed will be fruitful, this promise will last forever, he will be a protective God to Abraham's seed forever, and the land that is promised to Abraham's seed is also promised to them forever. What we're seeing here is that God started out by promising to Abram a seed and a land, and now he's going further to say that everything you've been promised is promised to you and your seed forever. So we can see from this that the land is promised to this nation that is going to come directly from Abraham, and that's the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel is going to inherit the land promised to Abraham forever. And like we said, we can see the beginnings of that happening even today. Israel is in the land. They might not occupy all of it right now, but they're at least there for now. So the penultimate part of the Abrahamic promise was reiterating everything that has already been said, and that is a promise of a nation and a land to Abraham, but it also shows how this promise is a future promise to come too, meaning it hasn't yet been completely fulfilled. And we'll have a look at what that means a bit later. So the last part of the promise, that's in Genesis 22, verse 15 to 18. That's the final piece of the promises to Abraham, which I'll just read out now. "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, 'By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.'" Now, some context is required to understand this section and what God's talking about, but I'm sure most of us are familiar with this story. So between the last section of the promise, which we looked at earlier, and this section, Abraham finally had a son, like God told him that he would. Now, this son was called Isaac, and when Isaac had grown up, God commanded Abraham to offer his son, his only son, Isaac, as a sacrifice to God. Now we know that Abraham and Sarah were unable to naturally have children, but God allowed them to have this one son, Isaac, and then asked Abraham to offer him as a sacrifice. Now this would have been a huge deal for Abraham, because he was now at risk from a human point of view of losing his only son who came by a miracle from God. However, because of Abraham's amazing faith, he committed to offering his son, so much so that he had built the offering and had prepared his son to be offered before God stopped him and gave him a ram instead of his son. Now we know that this was a test God had given to Abraham to see what extent he would go to obey God, and he passed. This is why God gave Abraham this final part of the promise. He saw Abraham's amazing faith and blessed him and his nation further by saying, "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore." This is the final iteration of a multi-part promise that gave Abraham the final assurance that his seed, the one that would stem from his only son Isaac, would be blessed beyond measure as surely as God lived. So that is the history of why the nation of Israel has to be in the land of Israel, or the area of Palestine. Back in the 20th century and previous years, when the Balfour Declaration was being finalised, there was talk about the nation of Israel occupying alternative territories such as the Sinai Peninsula or Crimea or Guyana, Alaska, and even Australia. However, the plan of God and the promise to Abraham was that the people of Israel would occupy the territory, like we saw, between the great river of Egypt and the river Euphrates. So that's where they ended up. And that is why in 1917, the area of Palestine was declared as the national homeland for the Jewish people as part of that Balfour Declaration. We now know that the reason the nation of Israel exists and the reason that they are where they are right now is because of a promise made toward the beginning of the Bible to Abraham. That's why they are where they are, and that's why, through all the persecution they've been through, they still exist and are still a strong nation even today. Because, like God promised Abraham, he would make them a great nation. And they are. They most certainly are today. God is looking after the nation and pulling the strings, as we can see, so that they follow the path laid out for them since the beginning of the Bible. And we can see that happening. So like we saw in our lecture last week, during the Six-Day War, Israel managed to take out and destroy its immediately surrounding enemies when, on paper, there was no chance of them winning at all. But again, God's promise to Abraham came true, and God helped them, as a nation, destroy their enemies and win the war, and thus keeping the land promised to them all that time ago. And this is just a recent, historically proven record of Israel winning a war against its enemies, with little to no actual chance. But this actually happened all throughout the Bible in instances such as the 300 men of Gideon against the Midianites. There appeared to be no chance of winning, but with the help of God, the nation of Israel triumphed. And when reading the Bible, we can see all throughout that God has been with the nation of Israel, keeping that promise to Abraham. And this is why all throughout the Bible, the land that the nation of Israel calls home is referred to as the Promised Land. And it's a thing that people even say today. They refer to the land of Israel as the Promised Land, although they may not actually understand why it's called the Promised Land. But now we know it's because God promised to his people and to his friend Abraham, all that time ago, that that land would be promised to the nation of Israel. All right, now that we've had a look at why it's so important that the nation of Israel has control of the land, let's have a look at the area itself. So Israel is a country that borders Lebanon, it borders Syria and Jordan and Egypt. And it has shaky relationships or shaky past relationships with all of those countries that it borders. However, they've managed to, with God's help, as we know, keep a hold of the land for a while now. The reason the people of Israel are in their land today is because of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which we'll have a bit of a look at now. It's very interesting to look into the whole history of how the nation of Israel finally moved back into their rightful land after thousands of years away. Looking at all the little individual events that made this happen shows God's hand at work in bringing to pass this promise to Abraham and to his nation and to Abraham's seed. So it started in 1916 with Britain wanting to publicly acknowledge their support of Zionism and Zionism's focus on establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which is the current land of Israel. The reason for this is because Britain was concerned about the direction World War I was taking. By mid-1917, Britain and France were essentially in a stalemate with Germany on their Western Front, while their efforts to defeat Turkey in the Gallipoli Peninsula had ultimately failed. On the Eastern Front, one of their allies, Russia, was also in a bit of a pickle. The Russian Revolution in March of 1917 had toppled the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, and the Russian government was now struggling against national opposition to the country's futile war effort against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, although the United States had just entered the war on the Allied side, a large proportion of American troops were not due to arrive on the continent until the following year. And on top of all this, the British government made the decision to publicly support Zionism, which was a movement led in Britain by Chaim Weizmann, who was a Russian Jew living in England. There were a few motives behind the British government's decision in supporting Zionism. And firstly, the Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, and a few other leaders actually had a genuine belief in the righteousness of the Zionist cause. As well as that, the British government hoped that a formal declaration in favour of the Zionist movement would help gain Jewish support for the Allies in neutral countries that weren't involved in the war, and also in the United States and especially in Russia, where the anti-Semitic government had just been overthrown with the help of Russia's Jewish population. Also, despite Britain's earlier agreement with France, which shared their influence in Palestine, in the Palestine region after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, had come to sort of assume British dominance in the area, which so happened to be a land bridge between the countries of India and Egypt, which they deemed as essential. They believed that the establishment of a Zionist state there under British protection would accomplish all of these goals. However, over the course of the year of 1917, there was an anti-Zionist movement within Parliament which held up the progress of the planned declaration. Led by Edward Montagu, Secretary of State for India and one of the first Jews to serve in the British cabinet, the anti-Zionists believed that British-sponsored Zionism would threaten the status of the Jews who had settled in various European and American cities, and would also encourage anti-Semitic violence in the countries battling Britain in the war, especially within the Ottoman Empire. However, this opposition was overruled, and after attempting to gain the support of France, the United States and Italy with varying degrees of success, the British government went ahead with its plan to support Zionism. On November the 2nd in 1917, Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Walter Rothschild, who was a member of the Rothschild family and a prominent Zionist and friend of Chaim Weizmann, and it stated that His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. However, by the time that the statement was published in Britain and in international newspapers 1 week later, one of the major objectives of the whole effort had been rendered completely obsolete. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had taken power in Russia, and one of their first actions was to call for an immediate ceasefire. This therefore meant that Russia was out of the war, and no amount of persuasion from Zionist Jews could reverse their decision or that outcome, despite Britain's belief that they had a strong influence in Russia. The influence of the Balfour Declaration on the course of the post-war events was immediate. According to the mandate system created in 1919 by the Treaty of Versailles, Britain was entrusted with the temporary administration of Palestine, with the understanding that it would work on behalf of both its Jewish and Arab inhabitants. Now, the Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere, having competed in the war against Turkey, with the understanding that they would receive their own self-governing nation in Palestine, were obviously extremely annoyed about the whole situation. But regardless, in the years after World War I, Jewish population in Palestine increased dramatically, although so did instances of Jewish-Arab violence. The fact that the area was so volatile meant Britain delayed making a decision about what they would do with the whole situation in Palestine. But after World War II and the events in the Holocaust, many more nations in the area and internationally grew to support the Zionist movement, which ultimately led to the declaration in 1948 of the nation of Israel in their land, and in the land that God had set out for them at the beginning of the Bible in the promise to Abraham. So I'm sure you can see just through that brief story of the history of Israel going back to their homeland, the obvious hand of God at work in facilitating those small things to happen here and there, which ultimately gave the opportunity for the nation of Israel to become recognized for their persecution and to secure their own rightful land. So not only was God putting things into place to give the nation of Israel their rightful land, like he promised Abraham, but another reason he does this is to show his own hand at work for us to see and for future generations to see God working. So we know he's working because he said he would do all this. So we know that now it's happened. It was God pulling the strings and making it happen, which in turn gives us the faith that God keeps his word. But why am I saying this? Why is it so important or exciting for us to watch God giving the land to the nation of Israel? Why would it make us as believers in God so excited and so interested in watching all this happen? Well, the reason for this is bound up in what we briefly referred to earlier. We talked about the fact that there were a lot of references to a more permanent side of the promises, and the idea that this promise of Abraham to Abraham of a land is going to last forever, like we also referred to. Now, Abraham, in his mortal state at the time, obviously wasn't in a capacity to last forever. So why is the promise a permanent thing? Why would it benefit Abraham to be permanent and everlasting like God said? Well, there's multiple reasons for this, and I guess the first one is fairly simple. The promise was not just with Abraham and God, it was also a promise to the future nation of Israel. So like God promised in Genesis 17, he would establish his covenant between him and Abraham and his offspring after him throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to him and to his offspring after him. So it wasn't just a promise to Abraham, but rather a covenant that included Abraham and his entire seed, or all his descendants. And one of the reasons that covenant hasn't ended or died with Abraham is because there's still descendants of Abraham alive today. And therefore, God still has a promise to fulfill with them too. Now, there's another reason why this promise is an everlasting promise. And that's because it has what we call a secondary fulfillment. There's another reason why we as believers should be so interested in how God is fulfilling this promise and the steps he's taking to do so. The reason is because the references to the future seed of Abraham are not just referring to a physical seed of Abraham. they also refer to what we would call a spiritual seed of Abraham, a seed that isn't necessarily directly descended from Abraham's family. But how do we know this though? So if we have a look at Galatians 3, which was a letter written from Paul to the Galatians, we'll be able to see exactly how we know this. So Galatians 3, starting at verse 27 through to the end. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And here's the important bit. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So that particular quote is crucial in explaining and understanding how the promise to Abraham is important for us today. The reason it's important for us today is because, like it says, if we are Christ's, or if we are baptized into the name of Christ, we are counted as Abraham's offspring, or Abraham's seed, and therefore, by extension, we are the ones this promise has been made to, along with the natural seed of Abraham and the natural seed of Israel. So God, all the way back at the beginning of Israel, in Genesis, made this promise to Abraham, but also assured that in future, all future Jewish generations would have the chance to redeem the land, along with anyone else who wanted to be a part of it. So this promise is a promise to everyone. Like it says, neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female that God will not extend his promise to. He's included everyone right from the beginning. This land that God has chosen out, sorry, I've lost my place, bear with me. This land that God has chosen out is not just a chosen land for the nation of Israel, but it's for everyone. However, there is a condition that we can see in that quote there, at the beginning of that quote. It talks about those who are baptized into Christ. We can't receive the promise to Abraham without doing anything, because we're not direct descendants of Abraham, so it's not automatically applied to us. However, if we spiritually associate ourselves through baptism to Christ, who was a descendant of Abraham, we can become part of that spiritual seed of Abraham, and we will then be counted as a spiritual stem of the nation of Israel. This is why, like we said before, it's so interesting for us to watch how this promise is being fulfilled in the world around us. The reason is because the promise is to us if we choose to become a part of it. So we've seen that the promise is to us, but we've also seen that it's to us if we choose to associate ourselves with Christ through baptism, or the putting on of Christ. The question remains then, how do we do this? So all baptism requires is a genuine belief in the things of God and an understanding that we, of ourselves, as mortal, sinful people, don't deserve the things promised to the physical and spiritual seed of Abraham by God. Like it says in Mark 16, verse 16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. It's not an overly complicated procedure to become recognized as spiritual Israel. All we need to do is genuinely believe in God and the truth of the Bible, and like many others before us, we will become part of the promise to Abraham. We will become part of the seed promised to Abraham all that time ago, and therefore we will become heirs of that land promised to him. God promised to Abraham a seed that would be like the sand on the seashore and the stars of heaven, so innumerable that no one would ever be able to count them. Even today, that seed is still growing, with more and more people coming to accept the truth of the Bible, and the promises made by God to Israel's forefathers. Those promises are also made to us if we choose to do the right thing and be baptized into the name of Christ. Now, as we learned, the promise to Abraham is a permanent promise, as God said that this would be an everlasting covenant. We learn from John 5 and the words of Christ that this commitment to be baptized into the name of Christ not only promises us and the nation of Israel and Abraham the land, but also eternal life. John 5 verse 16 says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life." So this tells us that if we choose to be baptized into the name of Christ and believe on the things of God, not only do we receive receive the land promised to Abraham and his seed, we also receive everlasting life. We receive everlasting life and an everlasting promise of an everlasting gift of the everlasting land of Israel. All of this essentially means that right from the beginning of the world, when God made the promises to Abraham, God has called us out to be a part of this promise to Abraham and his seed. He's chosen this land, the land of Israel, for the seed of Abraham, and also for us, the spiritual seed of Abraham, to inherit. We are essentially God's chosen people, and therefore the land of Israel is the land chosen for us to inherit. Thank you.